Every year, hundreds of people disappear in puzzling conditions in North America's forests. I'm talking about people who were right in front of their friends or loved ones and suddenly disappear without a trace. Sometimes they are found, but in places that seem impossible to reach. A former police detective named David Paulides has written a series of books called Missing 411, where he investigates these incredibly bizarre cases. Today we're going to look at 3 cases of Missing 411 that, even among bizarre disappearances, stand out as particularly bizarre. Story number 1. On June 16, 1946, 5 members of the Van Holst family arrived at Devil's Den State Park in western Arkansas to spend a week in a cabin they had rented. After unpacking, the father, along with his 8-year-old daughter Catherine and her 2 older brothers, headed to the swimming area, which was a creek that led to the side of a dam. Once they reached the creek, Catherine and her 2 brothers got into the water and started playing along with other children who were there. The father stood on the edge to watch them. The swimming area had a really deep section right against the dam wall where swimming was allowed, but kids who weren't good swimmers tended to avoid it. Catherine wasn't much of a swimmer, and at one point, she slipped into the deep section. Neither her father nor her siblings noticed, but a woman who was at the camp, and whom the Van Holst family did not know, saw Catherine struggling and pulled her out of the water. Catherine was fine, and the woman told her to be more careful and not swim in the deep end if she wasn't a good swimmer. Catherine nodded. As they talked, Catherine's father heard them and looked in their direction, seeing his daughter talking to a stranger. He made a sound and waved his hand to get the woman's attention, asking her what she was doing talking to her daughter. The woman, who seemed to understand the father's discomfort, explained that she was just helping her daughter out of the water and that everything was fine. The father told Catherine to be more careful and not go to the deep end. Catherine nodded, and instead of returning to the water, she headed to the other side of the dam, where there was a gradual slope of large rocks that children used to climb while their parents watched them from the swimming area. Catherine's father kept an eye on his 2 sons and Catherine as well, alternating his gaze between them. But in a moment, when he looked at his children and then looked back at Catherine, she had disappeared. He got up and walked towards the spot, thinking that maybe he had gone down to the bottom and was out of his sight because he had crouched down. However, when he reached the edge and looked down, he wasn't there. He looked around, thinking it was impossible that he had disappeared so quickly. He asked his children if they had seen Catherine, but they hadn't. He also asked the woman who had pulled her out of the water, but she said the last time she saw her, she was on the rocks. Soon, Catherine's father began calling out her name, asking everyone in the camp for help in searching for her. People jumped into the water on both sides of the dam and searched the entire area, but there was no sign of the girl. After an hour of searching, the father went to look for the police. After 2 days of searching the thick forest surrounding the dam and finding no sign of Catherine, authorities decided it was more likely that she had drowned, either above or below the dam, rather than going into the woods, considering where she was last seen. They started draining the 2 sections of water to see if his body was at the bottom, but they found nothing, so they went back to search the forest. On June 22nd, 6 days after Catherine's disappearance, a group of searchers were 7 miles deep into the woods, climbing a mountain and calling her name. Suddenly, a little girl dressed only in a bathing suit came out of a cave, looked at them, and said, "Here I am." The seekers couldn't believe it. It was Catherine. Aside from a few scratches on her arms and insect bites, she seemed perfectly fine. They even said she was strangely calm, as if she was waking up from a dream. She was reunited with her family, who couldn't believe she was alive. She was taken to the hospital, and doctors confirmed that, apart from a few superficial cuts and insect bites, she was fine. 2 days later, she was discharged. This 8-year-old girl, who had never spent time in the woods before this trip to Devil's Den State Park, survived alone in the wilderness for 6 days and 6 nights, dressed only in a bathing suit. Despite there being no drinking water near where she was found on the mountain, it was determined that she was relatively well hydrated and had only lost a couple of pounds. Also, you have to understand the incredible distance he covered. Although it was found 7 miles from where it disappeared, that's the distance as the crow flies on the map. In nature, you don't walk in straight lines because of obstacles like mountains and trees. Rescuers believe the actual minimum distance she traveled to reach the cave was about 30 miles, and she did so barefoot. Catherine defied all models of search and rescue for 8-year-olds who are lost in the wild. It was far outside the bounds of what anyone would expect. Basically, I should have died. When authorities asked her how she did it, she said she didn't know, that she didn't remember how she got lost in the first place. He only remembered sleeping in hot grass the first night, and his next memory was waking up in a cave on the 6th day. He has no idea what happened between the 1st and 6th day, when he traveled those 30 miles and somehow found water and food to sustain himself. Some say this is just a very strange case where she got very lucky. But others think that something in the forest chased her, and her adrenaline took her to run the 30 miles to the cave, and because of the trauma of the experience, she forgot what happened. Story number 2. On April 29, 2001, 6-year-old Haley Zaga was hiking with her grandparents in a very rural area of Arkansas called the Upper Buffalo Wilderness Area. For an area to be considered a wildlife zone, there can be no vehicles of any kind, making it incredibly remote and wild, hence its name. They had taken a path that took them to the top of a cliff, about 60 meters above the starting point. They came to an amazing viewpoint from where you could see a river. Around 11 a.m., they turned around to go back. At approximately 11:30, as they were descending, Haley saw a waterfall on the side of the road and wanted to go see it. He asked his grandparents to go see the waterfall, but they, upon assessing the situation, saw that the only way to get to the waterfall was to climb a tree and descend a cliff. They didn't feel comfortable allowing their granddaughter to do that, so they told her no and that they should continue. Haley, being a 6-year-old girl, really wanted to see the waterfall and get away with it. She threw a tantrum, sat down on the road, and said that if they didn't take her to the waterfall, she wouldn't move and they would have to carry her. The grandparents told her they wouldn't carry her and that she needed to be a big girl and walk with them. Haley refused, so the grandparents said they would leave without her. They walked a little way down the trail, but they could still see her as it was broad daylight. They expected their granddaughter to get up and walk after them, and at some point she did. Haley got up and started walking, saying to wait for her. The grandparents continued to walk in front of Haley, and she was slowing down more and more on purpose to thwart them. The grandparents made sure to keep it in sight. They would walk around a bit and turn around to make sure he was there, repeating this over and over again. But at one point they turned and she wasn't there. The grandparents immediately ran back looking for her, thinking that she had probably hidden behind a tree to annoy them even more. They weren't too worried at first, and they started calling her, telling her to come out because they had to leave. But there was no answer, and she had completely disappeared. For the next 90 minutes, the grandparents ran back and forth on the trail, screaming his name to no avail. Finally, they went downstairs and called the police. The largest search and rescue operation in Arkansas history was launched to find Haley Zaga. It included hundreds of searchers on the ground, including 8 teams of dogs and helicopters flying overhead. There were firefighters and the National Guard involved, but after 2 days, despite the incredible search, no progress had been made. The only thing that had been found was that one of the dog teams had followed his trail to a nearby road where the dog stopped, signifying that the trail had been lost. Unfortunately, this suggested to investigators that Haley had likely been picked up by some motorist. However, 51 hours after the incident, 2 searchers far away from the main search area, about 3 kilometers from the place where she had disappeared, found her. She was sitting by a stream with her feet in the water. When he saw them, he waved and was asked if it was Haley Zaga, to which he replied that it was. He had a few scratches on his arm and face, but overall he seemed fine. Haley was reunited with her family and taken to the hospital for observation. After he regained his strength, investigators asked him what had happened. She said she was walking behind her grandparents and looked down. When she looked up again, not only had her grandparents disappeared, but she was surrounded by a wall of trees and didn't know where she was. Since he was only 6 years old, he didn't stop to look around or shout. He just kept walking in an unknown direction and never found the trail again. He said it soon got dark and he slept on top of the cliff. The next day, when the sun came up, he descended the cliff and reached the river, walked along the river until he found a cave where he slept the second night. The next day, she was found. After giving this explanation, the researchers had many questions. They asked her, for example, why the helicopters hadn't seen her with their thermal cameras if she had actually spent the first night on the cliff. She replied that that's what Alice told her to do. The investigators, intrigued, asked her who Alicia was, and Haley replied that it was her imaginary friend she had met on the cliff. Immediately, the investigators and parents thought Haley was dealing with the trauma by creating an imaginary friend, so they didn't ask any more questions about Alicia and continued to ask her about how she had moved from the cliff to the river. They asked him how he had gotten off the cliff, as there was only one path that was hard to find, especially if he had strayed off the trail. Haley replied that Alice had taken her to a trail and guided her up the cliff, making sure she didn't fall. Parents and researchers began to think that maybe Alice wasn't just an imaginary friend, especially if he had helped her physically. Haley was asked what Alicia was like, and she said she had black hair, brown eyes, was a little shorter than her, was 4 years old, liked to tell jokes and sing songs. Haley began to sing songs and tell jokes she had learned from Alice. Although Haley gave a vivid description of this 4-year-old girl named Alice, it didn't seem possible that she was real, so parents and researchers continued to treat Alice as an imaginary friend and coping mechanism. The investigators finished the interview with Haley, gathering as much information as possible about how she got from the cliff to the river, and seeing that Haley was okay, they concluded their investigation. Haley's case was a big event and was all over the news, especially after she was found. During her interview, when she mentioned that her imaginary friend Alicia had helped her down from the cliff and taken care of her, this was published. Some readers noticed that another girl had disappeared in the same place 23 years earlier. It was a 4-year-old girl with black hair and brown eyes named Alana, who had died on those cliffs. After this connection was established, the news garnered national attention, suggesting that Haley's imaginary friend was actually Alana and that she had been her guardian angel. In fact, Haley was invited on the show Dateline to talk about her imaginary friend. Haley, now 25, posted a video on her YouTube channel where she tells her story of what happened during those 51 hours she was missing. In the video, she talks about her imaginary friend and says that before Alicia, she had never had an imaginary friend, and that after Alicia, she never had one again. But at the time, Alicia was very real to her, and she doesn't know who or what she was, but she saved her life. Story number 3. In September 2012, Linda Ortega, 53, went to visit her brother Eddie Huff in St. Joe, Arkansas. St. Joe is a very rural area of Arkansas, located about a mile from Buffalo River National Park. The park is densely forested and mountainous, with hundreds of small bodies of water scattered throughout the area. On Saturday, September 22nd, Linda and Eddie decided to go for a walk in the park because Eddie had heard about a great place to fish and wanted to find it. In the search for the site, they veered off the trail and became disoriented. They realized they had lost their way, but it was broad daylight, and they thought they would soon find the trail. However, as the sun was setting, They still hadn't found the trail and realized they were very lost. Then some very strange things happened that we only have a marginal understanding of. We know that the brother and sister were together the first day they disappeared. We know they were together the next day, Sunday, still looking for a way out of the park, but at the end of the day they were still lost. Then on Monday, we know that the couple broke up because Eddie walked out of the park, got in his car like nothing had happened, drove back to his house, went inside, and his family asked him where he had been since he had been missing. They also asked him where Linda was, to which he replied that everything was fine and that he had left Linda at a relative's house. His family looked at him puzzled, telling him that he had been missing for 3 days, but Eddie insisted that everything was fine. When asked more questions about what specifically he had done, how he had gotten lost, what time he had dropped off Linda, Eddie began to realize that he didn't really know what had happened. Her family called the relative to whom Eddie claimed to have left Linda, but the relative said he didn't have Linda there and hadn't spoken to Eddie or Linda. The family then asked Eddie again about Linda's whereabouts, and he replied that he had no idea. The family contacted the police and a search for Linda was launched. They searched all over the park for days without finding any trace of Linda, and people began to care a lot about her. Then on Thursday, 3 days after Eddie left the park and 5 days after they originally disappeared, some ATV searchers found Linda, who was alive, about 2 miles from the park's entrance in a very dense area. Initially, like her brother Eddie, she had no idea what was going on. She said she didn't understand how she got to where she was and was very confused. She was taken to the hospital and placed under medical care, and she ended up doing well. While in the hospital, Linda began to reminisce about what happened and told an incredible story. She said she and Eddie went to the park to find that fishing spot and at some point strayed off the trail believing they would find it, but got lost. They were sure they would find the trail and leave the same day, but they didn't, and the sun went down, forcing them to sleep in the wild. The next day, they continued to search the trail and called for help, but there was no one around. They were in a very dense part of the forest and didn't find the trail, so they slept back in the wild. Linda said her memories of the next day, Monday, began to become very hazy. He woke up and, for some reason, started running into the woods, thinking that Eddie was injured and needed help. It was probably at that moment that Eddie, in his state of confusion, came out of the park. Meanwhile, Linda kept running and screaming for help, even though she was in the middle of nowhere. Miraculously, he saw a group of people in the distance who looked like hikers and began yelling at them and waving for their attention. She said they all stopped and looked at her, but showed no signs of hearing her or tried to interact with her. They just looked at her. Linda thought that was very strange, but she kept running towards them and screaming, trying to get their attention. When she was about 100 meters away from them, instead of answering her, they all hid behind the trees, as if they were trying to hide from her. Linda said this was the first time she felt really uneasy about what was happening, but she was desperate for help and kept walking towards them. When she got to about 50 meters, they all poked their heads out to look at her and then hid again. Linda got very frightened and backed up until she was about 100 or 150 meters away again, and the group came out from behind the trees and continued to stare at her. Linda was terrified. She didn't know who or what those things were, but they weren't there to help her. Her memory then became very hazy, as suddenly her next memory is lying on the ground in a pitch-black forest without her brother around, hearing footsteps that she believed were from that group of people or things approaching, even though she couldn't see anything due to the darkness. All night long, she heard the sounds of those people or things walking around the perimeter where she was lying, totally exposed in the middle of the forest. Linda said her memories from that moment to her rescue are all mixed up, but one in particular stood out because it was so scary. He said that one of the last mornings he was there, he woke up, opened his eyes, and although it was still dark, the sun was beginning to rise and there was enough light to make out the surroundings of the forest. She sat down and immediately had the feeling that she was being watched, although she did not know by whom or where that feeling was coming from. Then she heard a movement to her right and saw, next to a tree about 20 yards away, the dark silhouette of a man looking at her, featureless, just a shadowy figure. Horrified, she realized that there was another and another and another all around her, staring at her. She was very frightened, and as she watched them, they seemed to register that she saw them, and at that moment, they all turned around and started running into the woods in different directions. After that, you have no idea of the sequence of events or what happened. She only knows that during the entire time she was there, she felt scared, and that there were people watching her in the forest, until at some point, rescuers arrived and saved her. Linda's totally unbelievable account, combined with Eddie's bizarre behavior, baffled investigators. They didn't know how to interpret this. How did Eddie find his way back? And why did he think Linda was at a relative's house? Who were the people Linda saw, and why don't any of them remember 90% of the experience? One theory is that they might have eaten berries or another food with hallucinogenic properties and were hallucinating the entire time. However, if you follow David Paulides' missing 4-to-1-1 phenomenon, you know that there are many other cases of people disappearing into the forests of North America without ingesting hallucinogenic food or liquids and still have similar experiences to Linda and Eddie. So how do you explain that?